All right. What's up? What's up? What's up? How we doing today, guys? This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today, how you guys doing? You hear me all right? Are we live? Hello? Hello? I think we're live right now. How we all doing today? This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today, I want to talk to you about being addicted to the world and the nature of servitude. And so today's video may get a little heavy at points. Really, what prompted me to make this video was over the last few days, I've actually been dealing with a childhood friend who just passed away from a heroin overdose. So Friday, Saturday, and Sunday has mostly been spent with some really old friends from high school, people I haven't seen in ages, telling old stories, rehashing old memories. But I have a whole whirlwind of thoughts given my experience this past weekend and burying somebody who I've known since I was in fourth grade. And so that's what I want to talk about today. You know, of course, for my friend, he succumbed to a drug addiction, heroin. But just my experience over the past 3 days, I have a lot of thoughts in regards to addictions in general and our attachments to this world. And so that has just got me thinking sort of in a theological context. It's got me thinking about current events that are playing out in society. It got me thinking about my own life and where I'm weak, where I can get better, and where just in society, generally speaking, how we become addicted to so many things and the necessity for a goal that really transcends creation itself. Of course, that's going to be God, right? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And so today's video, I first want to give the theological framework for the discussion in regards to the nature of servitude and how there is no not having a master. And this ties into, again, I'm going to be rehashing, there's going to be a sort of a lot of storytelling in today's live stream, but even at the sort of celebratory party after the funeral on Saturday, you know, there was a few people who were friends with the gentleman I was friends with, and they would certainly identify as Satanists, wearing different things, tattoos everywhere. And so the idea of no God, no master, no slave was brought up. And of course, I'm in an area, or at least at the party, you know, I'm the only one that's like an outspoken Christian, you know, doing all this stuff. So I just want to talk about and reflect on some of the things that I saw in terms of patterns, in terms of ideas, in terms of all these different things that I think, at least it's useful to have a conversation. I have no idea where this is going to go. It's going to be a lot of rambling. It's going to be a lot of just talking about things that are on my mind. So just want to do that. So to start, the framework is the nature of servitude. And before we get into, because you're going to see how that's going to be tied to addiction to this world, addiction to all these different things. But servitude in general, you know, as Christians, we're called to serve. And that plays in two different ways. Of course, we serve others, but we're also serving the will of God. And by serving the will of God, we then serve others. And so this idea of, well, the end of this video is going to be talking about then logos, by putting God as our true north, or you could think of it as our legend on the map. It's going to be important because it's going to allow us to moderate our attachment to creation. It's going to give us something that transcends creation, ultimately the creator of creation. And by doing so, it's going to have this ripple effect in our lives in terms of the patterns that are created. And so that is sort of tied to then, right, serving God's will. But the nature of servitude in general is, and I'm talking about slavery here, in a multitude of facets. So it's always a submission of one person to another person's will. This is the nature of slavery itself. And so I wanted to start this video by at least referencing Romans 1, where Paul, a bondsmith of Jesus Christ, is called to be an apostle. And that's literally how Romans 1 starts out. And the idea that Paul is a slave to Jesus Christ. and how that works. How do we understand that? How is that so beneficial? And again, in terms of sort of a true north, orienting ourselves in this world. And so related to being a slave to God, I'm not big on maybe using the slavery analogy or the language, but there's no easy way out of this life, really, because as soon as you become a slave to God, if you will, life's going to be more difficult than if you just succumb to the powers that be in this world. And so there is no easy way out, and you're always going to be subservient to somebody's will, whether that's God's will or your will. But the idea and the framework of this video is that your will is ultimately going to be an appeasement to the will of the prince of this world. And so when you are tied up with addictions of any sort, and so we're going to be talking about sex, we're going to be talking about image of oneself, we're going to be talking about intoxication, we're going to be talking about power. So kind of the more, the things you would easily think about when you think about sort of attachments to this world. But I want to go one by one. I have bullet points in regards to each one of these that I want to discuss and just talk about and kind of reflect on. And so being a slave to God, one of the things that I wanted to say is that you're not a revolutionary. And what we're seeing in today's society with so much turmoil is that we are seeing a revolution. And shout out to Rokor with their recent letter of comparing what we're seeing with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. I think there are a lot of parallels there. And even as I mentioned, the sort of idea of equality, which we've talked about in previous videos, that Father Schmemann talked about, and I try to talk about in a video, these abstract concepts, whether it be equality or freedom or justice, as opposed to a more personal understanding of these ideas and enacting those in the world. So if you're wanting to create more justice in the world, well, you do that on a one-to-one basis. You don't do that at an abstract level that really individuals then kind of get pushed to the side. And ultimately, these abstract ideas, these social justice warrior concepts, are going to be detrimental to enacting what it is that they think they're enacting. And the framework is that they are ultimately slaves to this world. And that's the only choices we have. We either slaves to God or slaves to this world. And like I said, there's no easy way out. Either path is not going to be fun. Now, you may enjoy being a slave to this world a little bit more. There's certainly going to probably be a lot more pleasure and hedonism to it, but ultimately it's not going to be fulfilling. Ultimately, it's not going to be fulfilling, and that's how I want to tie that back to a sort of lack of meaningfulness, and even in my buddy who, passed away. So, one of the things that you hear Satanists talk about is, again, this mantra that I'm going to say this over and over again in today's video, is that no God, no master, no slave. And so from a Satanist theological idea, they're the ones that are truly liberated. They have no master that they're serving in their mind. Now, of course, there's theistic Satanists. You have the Anton LaVey, more the atheistic Satanists. We even saw, some of you guys probably saw on social media, the Church of Satan going and promoting BLM. I don't want to say that out loud because I'm sure that's part of the algorithm. So we're going to be using a lot of initials today for things. But we saw how they're in full support of BLM. And, I myself have very critical opinions of these organizations, be it, Antifa, BLM, all this stuff. So the prince of this world, even from the accounts of Satanists, is that he liberates you from God, and that God is the ultimate slaveholder. He's the ultimate slave master. And if you really want to be free, if you really, in their eyes, if you really want to know the truth, well, then you want to not have any master at all. But of course, that's never the case. That's never the case. And this is going to, again, tie back to the story that I want to talk about in regards to the sort of celebratory party that I was at, where, I see so many addictions in people, and these same individuals who are promoting Satanism, and they're kind of perceived to be these sort of cool figures, right? They're popular musicians at the party I was at, and so other guys were sort of envious of them, if you will, and I just thought it's just the idea, just watching them interact, watching really their own addictions to the world, hearing their stories, never trying to, I didn't talk to them about anything. I was very friendly. I was just more of a watcher, and I was just watching people. And it's so funny because they are the ultimate slaves. They're the ultimate slaves. They're the true indentured servants because they're wrapped up in whatever passions they have. Because what would prompt somebody to have discipline in the first place if it wasn't some larger purpose outside of oneself? But if you're making oneself God, that is the ultimate purpose. And so you're going to fall back into these same patterns of self-worship, of really addiction to the world. And I'm just going to, I have a few mantras I'm probably going to be saying over and over again. So the Bible verse that I really wanted to make central for this video is Matthew chapter 6:24, and that reads, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon." Again, Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. And this idea of two masters is that's all you have. You only have two masters. Now, that second master comes in a variety of forms because it ultimately is the evil one. So that may be a self-delusion, a self-narcissism, a solipsism in which you believe you are God, or it's an outright worship of this world, whether it be power, whether it be sex, whether it be intoxication and drugs as a way to escape. And we're going to be talking about these things all in more detail. But you're ultimately going to be caught up in that. And how this verse ends with talking about you cannot serve God and Mammon, and thinking about Mammon at a sort of deeper level. Mammon is just money, right? But what is money? Money being this central motivating force in society that's created by men. It's created by men. Mammon is a man creation. So those who are in worship or service to Mammon, it's a worship of this world. It's a worship of man's power to create. So it's a sort of mockery of God's ability to create and the way in which we're actually called to be kings and queens of creation, which of course fell apart after the fall. So that Bible verse, Matthew 6:24, and I'll read it one more time. "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon." And so, as I said, there is no not having a master. It's who are you going to be ultimately accountable to? And the paradox of all this stuff, and this is a real paradox, is that to be a slave to God, to live a more disciplined life, is the only way to truly be free. And I've mentioned in other videos, somebody like a Jocko Willink, who doesn't talk about theology. I have no idea what his religious or theological disposition is, but he has the mantra, discipline equals freedom. And that ties solidly within most spiritual systems, of course, but our orthodoxy, our Christian theology is tied up with self-discipline and really controlling oneself, being fully in control of oneself. And so we're going to get into masturbation and pornography later, but these are things all of us as men, I'm sure, are struggling with, and it's attachment to this world, whether it be our own sexual drives, sort of somatic processes, our bodies, the sort of materiality in which we're entrapped in or wrapped up in, but it's also the world in which is trying to deceive us and get us inverted and move us in directions that aren't in our own favor. And so the paradox is that slavery to God is true freedom, and having no master, which is the mantra of Satanism, right? It's the mantra of a lot of atheists, right? The idea that somehow you're going to be held accountable to your sky daddy is a delusion, but also an inability to sort of intellectually or cognitively mature and see oneself as their sort of sole source of truth, the sole source of purpose, and all this stuff, which again, I'm going to get into, is an ultimate lack of meaning. It's going to be meaningless in the end when you go down that road. And so no master is to be an indentured servant. The idea of having no master is really to be the ultimate indentured servant. And so it's so funny then that mantra within Satanism, no God, no master, no slave. And that being the ultimate trick, because if you wanted to enslave somebody, of course, you'd want them to think they're free. And God asks us to be much more disciplined with our lives, much more meticulous and deliberate in the things that we do, and ultimately follow His will, which sounds, well, it's certainly not easy. And then that's mocked by those like the Satanists, because I'm going to give more details in regards to the party I was at and hearing conversations and sort of mocking this idea, right? This is what people who can't fully mature do, right? They depend on this idea of a God. But really following God's will is ultimate freedom, because you're not going to be attached to this world due to the repetitious patterns of taking control and being responsible for one's own self, being culpable, being accountable. And so responsibility itself, I think it's very interesting, and to try to tie that back into even a more contemporary understanding is looking at what's happening with the events of Minneapolis, and then whether it be on the left or the right spectrum, the sort of scapegoating, whether that be Antifa, whether that be the police department, whether that be the patriarchy, whether that be white supremacy, whether that be the media, whether that be the Democrats, and never really putting accountability and culpability of where it should be, which is on the specific community that has the problems, quote unquote, with the police. And what is their cultural attitude? What is it, their behavioral patterns that lead to mass incarceration, despite, the numbers in which they occupy within society, and the ability to keep them in a neotenized form, right? A neoteny is just a term I've used in previous videos. It's a biological term meaning an animal species that fails to mature fully, or another way to phrase it is that they retain juvenile characteristics into adulthood. And so one of the ways in which we can attain juvenile characteristics into adulthood is by not taking responsibility for ourselves. And this is a form of the scapegoating that I'm seeing in modern society in regards to the particular community that seems to be they feel that they get the short end of the stick in regards to their treatment by the police. Yet I've had friends, due to this, I have a different opinion than they do. Black gentleman, been friends with him for a while. We went to Mexico. He was my roommate. And now that I have a different opinion, I'm a racist. And so when I bring up statistics, when I bring up facts, when I bring up, the fact that the attitude and the topics that are described within their own music that is celebrated actually perpetuate a feedback loop that keeps them in the same place in which they're trying to no longer occupy, somehow that's racist. Somehow actually trying to talk about fatherlessness or education or illiteracy, well, that's all racist. And this is a way in which responsibility has been abdicated in our society. And when we look at Christ, we look at, God incarnate, we look at the ultimate source of responsibility to die for everyone's sins. How could you take more responsibility, right? If you're just to theoretically describe an instance in which somebody could take the most responsibility as possible, I can't think of anything more than to die for the wrongs of every person that had ever lived. And so that is a very powerful archetype. And I think, and I've talked about this in previous videos in regards to masculinity and why men following in the footsteps of Christ, which is following God's will, which is then the whole premise of this video is where actual freedom comes from, that we have to take more responsibility for ourselves. And by taking responsibility for ourselves, we actually create better patterns in reality, but we have more meaning in our lives. And in previous videos I talked about where I see the four main sources of responsibility of meaning being God himself. God is the ultimate source of meaning. Meaning doesn't exist without God. We also get a great deal of meaning just from our own existence, from being, therefore health and our bodies, being alive. And then, of course, our goals, our dreams, the things that we put before ourselves to accomplish, and then actually following through with that is real meaning. But of course, that takes discipline, that takes responsibility, that takes a lot of effort, that takes planning. But then family and having children and having real relationships, having love, having friendships, that is real meaning. And all that requires a sense of responsibility, whether it means, even if you have a friendship, you have to be responsible for speaking the truth, being honest, being a good person, being a good friend. And we see in society that the way in which I believe evil works is trying to get people to abdicate responsibility. And this is a way in which if we want to follow God, we actually want to take more and more responsibility for ourselves and for others. And to point the finger is never going to be the option. And even if you, even if it's not totally your fault, by trying to take more and more responsibility, our lives are only going to get more and more meaningful. And then because we're trying to do that, I think it's going to play itself out in more beautiful and beautiful patterns. Because again, we're following the will of God. And so servitude then is really the exchange of one's energy to accomplish the work of someone else. Slavery and servitude is the exchange of one's energy to accomplish the work of someone else. And so when we think then about being a slave of God, we are ultimately completing the will and the work of God himself in this world. That's not something to be afraid of. That's not something to even see as, degrading, because sometimes the way, if you use slave language to talk about being a slave to God, that can seem sort of degrading. That can seem like, oh, you have no real sense of self, right? Given a sort of larger concept of slavery being your food's provided, your housing provided, all these different things, right? But that is ultimately our goal. If we're going to be identifying as Christians, if we're going to be identifying as people who are trying to follow God, well then what could be more fulfilling than trying to complete his work in this world? And that is slavery. That is servitude. And when we think about then serving others, that all ties together. And I think that's a really beautiful way then to look at it from a Christian perspective, and but also to look at it in regards to evil. And so what is evil trying to get us to do? We'll exchange our energy to complete its work. And ultimately its work is a corruption of our own souls and taking our souls by our own free will, because we are made in the image of God. So this is exactly what I feel like the world is doing. You see it over and over again. And so when we get into these addictions, then what are these addictions? These are ways in which evil, Satan, the devil, the fallen world is wanting to take one's energy in exchange for the accomplishing of its own work, which is ultimately destruction of your own soul, the destruction of the image in which you're made in God. That's what it's trying to destroy. And so that is kind of the framework and that I'm bringing to this video, or at least this discussion today, in regards to God, in regards how do we understand these addictions, how do we understand servitude, and so how does this expressing itself in the current society and the current situation in which we see? And well, I think simplistically, and I know that I don't want to be too generalistic in the things that I say, but they are going to generally be general. But we see a difference between chaos and order. And I think people's predisposition to addictions to this world is going to differentiate and bifurcate where people stand in between these processes, chaos and order. And when the conversations I've had with friends in regards to what's going on, I see those who are more addicted to this world are much more in favor of the chaos. And I see those who lived more disciplined lives, who ultimately lived lives of more meaning, who ultimately live more godly lives, they're the ones that are more interested in order. And so the destruction of Western civilization is ultimately what's going on. This is no surprise. The reason why Western civilization is not because white people per se, it's because Western civilizations represents Christianity on this planet. And so that's both Eastern and Western Europe, essentially, that has a long historical trajectory with Christian culture, Christian values, right? So the destruction of Western civilization, that's why you're hearing all this talk about white privilege, because technically, if we were to take that idea as serious as they want to lay it out, about the hegemony of a culture, the majority of one's culture having privileges over the minority counterparts within that society, well, then we should hear about Chinese privilege, Japanese privilege, Indian privilege. We should hear about African privilege, because this concept should then apply to all facets of society, but we don't. Why? Because that's not the way in which this is being used. It's only being used as a deconstructive tool to create more chaos, create more tensions within itself, so then it's easier to manipulate. It's easier to funnel in a particular direction, which of course we know is going to be a degenerate, most likely it's going to take a sort of communistic framework. Why communism? Again, because it's an absence of God, because God becomes the state. Look at the Soviet Union, look at communist China, look at Vietnam. That communism is tied to the concept that man is God, that there is no ultimate authority of the universe and of reality. And so if that's the case, well, then man is God. Man's will is the ultimate will. And therefore, in my mind, you're going to be subservient to the devil himself, because that's the game, is to get you to think that it's all about yourself. And once you do that, you're going to be addicted to this world, whether that be power in the form of Mao Zedong or the Soviet, Lenin, Stalin, whatever it is, or maybe it's sex addiction, again, drug addiction. We're going to get into these different things, power addiction. But as soon as we sort of elevate a sort of apotheosis, as you heard me talk about in previous videos in regards to Luciferianism, man becomes God, and as soon as that happens, man's addicted to this world. And that's why it's no brain buster that they always refer the universe as God, because they are addicted to creation itself. And so GF, George, as you know, who died at the hands of the Minneapolis police officer. I figured it's probably a hot word on YouTube. That's why I didn't want to say his full name, but we'll just call him GF. We can see then, taking the framework that I just laid out, how he is a martyr of slaves to this world. And this is why we see the sort of just the valorization, the elevation of the worship of this man, despite previous arrest records, as you guys know, I'm sure, regards to armed robbery, threatening to shoot a baby and a woman inside a pregnant woman's stomach, been arrested multiple times for drugs, had a bad cocaine addiction. When the only reason the police officers were there is because he was using counterfeit money while high on fentanyl, while high on meth, while high on all these other drugs. We see then somebody who's totally addicted to this world. And we see how the idea of a Christian martyr is inverted. And we see a martyr to this world. We see somebody who's actually, I'm not saying he's a saint. I'm not saying anything about his theological understanding, but I'm just saying that his life represents somebody who's no longer in control of themselves. That ultimately, in my mind, the prince of this world is in control, because he's already become addicted to the things this world can offer. And that's what we have to do as Christians, is not fall victim to. And so, GF, again, the way in which he's being celebrated is that he is a martyr for being a slave to this world. And this is why it's so taboo to bring up the sort of factual nature of his own record. Now, another way in which I'm seeing this sort of dialect express itself, and again, I'm not trying to take one side or the other, I'm just wanting to highlight sort of ideas, sort of phenomenon, and that is that the police are being scapegoated. Now, I've had bad encounters with police officers. I know police brutality exists. That's not what I'm saying. So I'm not trying to, this is blue lives versus black lives, or, I'm not doing that. But I'm just trying to show how symbolically this is working its way out, and that police are being scapegoated because of the way in which they maintain order in society. Because ultimately, to have a revolution, which is, well, here, let me just speak on the revolutionary idea. Again, being a slave to God, you'll never be a revolutionary because you're subservient to God's will. The only way to be a revolutionary is really to sort of take the yoke of God off your back. And so, again, this idea of the satanic idea of the liberation of no God, no master, no slave, which is ultimately what the devil would want in the first place. And so we see order and chaos, the mob taking over power. We see the defunding and the dismantling of police forces across the country. Again, I'm not trying to take one side or the other. I'm trying to talk about how this is working, at least in my mind, at a sort of psychological level in society. And that the police represent order. And the revolutionary spirit, which is ultimately about no longer being tied to God and God's will. E. Michael Jones, I don't know if you guys have the Jewish revolutionary spirit. I have the book right over here. But this is ultimately the idea. And this is ultimately why when we talk about that particular tribe, what we mean it as a sort of theological category, as somebody who has seen themselves become God, become ultimate authority. And I think that once you see this, it's so much more useful that to be the revolutionary, it's always going to be really antagonistic to God's will, and therefore it's always going to be related to sin, whether it be the counterculture of the 1960s, whether it be some of the communist revolutions, again, and then look at sexual morality, look at all these different aspects from a Christian worldview. See if they begin to violate what we would consider norms for more sinful behavior. And I guarantee you almost every single time it's the normalization of sin. And that is going to be tied to this liberation ideology. And so the liberation ideology is that these particular groups of people, black people, are being held down by the police, a force of order. And therefore we must dismantle, defund these sources of order. Not I'm saying there's not a legitimate conversation to be had there. Of course, we'll never have a legitimate conversation because that's not the point of all this. The point is to manipulate emotions and energy by those who are still attached to this world. And that's why when you look at people that are so in favor of what's going on, it's the celebrities, it's it's everybody who has really an addiction to this world. The social media companies that want to silence everybody who think that themselves being God, which I'm going to be talking about when we get to the idea of power. But we see criminals being set free, and we see law-abiding citizens being arrested. So take, for example, during the whole, pandemic, we saw multiple criminals being released. Now we're seeing through all the looters and stuff like that, we're seeing AGs, attorney generals in various states, New York, Minneapolis, refusing to prosecute anybody that the police arrest. Well, then what's the purpose of the police in the first place? Obviously not what we would think it is, but it at the same time we see police officers being. I'm not talking about the Minneapolis incident. I'm mostly talking about New York right now. I'm talking about look at Dallas and the woman who opened her hair salon during the quarantine period, and how she was arrested, and how that judge wanted to put her in prison for a considerable amount of time, in my opinion, all for wanting to be free and be able to make her own money, and all her hairdressers have their own money. That was deemed more offensive than destroying people's businesses, than stealing property, than even committing real violence. Look at how many people have been injured in all these protests. And so it's so funny, the hypocrisy, because how many people have died in the protests in the name of the death of one individual? And then at the same time, all these people shouting about Black lives, do they care about the slave trade that's existing in Libya right now? I mean, the hypocrisy couldn't be any more, palpable, that under the Obama administration, through the Hillary Clinton State Department, Libya, one of the most stable and prosperous countries in Africa, was destabilized and now has become the center of the slave trade of black men and women. So it's all just a manipulation. And the way in which they're manipulating people is, again, an addiction to their own egos. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about in regards to moral superiority, and another way in which people are manipulated. And so all this stuff, if you don't think that there's a sort of theological or religious component to all this, just go on Twitter and search the hashtag dethrone God, or type in attack and dethrone God, and you'll see a whole list of people who are in support of, again, these particular movements, who are open about what this is about. Again, this is all about the idea of patriarchy, which is going to be a theological understanding. I mean, I've talked before about the foul logocentrism. So the idea of logos, the idea of order, the idea of objective reality, which is something I'm going to hit on here because that even ties to my experience this past weekend at the funeral, dealing with a lot of my old friends, and where they're at in their own lifestyles. And what I was so surprised about was the reluctancy from a lot of my friends to say that reality is actually objective, and that they're sort of tied into this whole mind state that everything is subjective. And so I want to speak more on that. But if you want to see how this is really theological in its essence, just type in on Twitter hashtag dethrone God or attack and dethrone God, because that's the full statement. And then look at the icons, look at the names of the people who are speaking. And to me, it becomes quite clear what this is really about. And then that leads me to the kneeling, because again, it's a form of submission. And who are we kneeling to? Who are we kneeling to? And so I'm sure you guys have seen all these videos of police forces, of National Guard platoons, of various individuals, our political leaders, all taking a knee in regards to BLM, in regards to Black Lives Matter. So what does this mean? Other than, in my mind, it's a submission to the powers of this world. Because again, I've already highlighted all these internal hypocrisies and contradictions related to this whole movement and the way everything's being framed for us. Yet to say that, to say it at all, is to be then a racist. And then the whole powers that be will try to take you down. I would not be surprised if this video gets flagged before I even finish the live stream, just because of the words that I've said. And so the kneeling is a submission to the mob. And if we live in a fallen world, who is the mob? And if we live, again, because for me as a Christian, the Bible is eternally true. And I can take, and I'm not trying to put this in a Jungian psychological framework, but when I read it, I am sort of looking at archetypes, not saying that that's all that is. I'm not Jordan Peterson, but I'm saying that's one dimension of truth, because truth, being the Logos, being who incarnated as Jesus Christ, is a multi-layered phenomenon. I mean, truth has many, many layers to it. But one of the archetypal truths is to look at Barabbas. And what did the mob demand? And the mob demanded the criminal over God himself. And so that's going to always be the nature of reality. That's always going to be the nature of this world, is the mob is always going to choose the criminal over God. And we still see it. We still see it. So then who are all these people kneeling to other than the mob, who is ultimately run by Satan himself, the devil, evil, addictions of this world? It's all the same thing. And I think once you see it from that sort of theological perspective, it brings things into view that maybe you didn't see before. And I think it's just so true that the spirit of this world, which is the spirit of the devil, the prince of this world, he's always getting people to acquiesce to the mob, because he has the mob. Because if we live in a fallen world, it's so much easier to go along with the mob than, again, the discipline to be a slave to God is actually to follow God's will. You're always going to be in opposition to this world, and it's going to cause then people to attack you, if not crucify you. I mean, metaphorically, I'm just using an analogy here, of course, but that's what they did to God. And again, it's telling you in nature an archetypal fact about reality itself, is that when you go to speak truth, if you try to follow the will of God, which I'm sure all of us are trying to do, and when none of us are that great at it, we mess up every single day. And again, we have our own addictions. I have my own addictions to this world, and I'll be very open about that once we get to that section in the video, at least in the conversation I wanted to have. So I'm not trying to pretend to be somebody I'm not, or be more holier than I am. I'm not. So I have no problem talking about my own problems as a way then to vocalize my own thoughts, and that will help other people. So who are they kneeling to? But they're kneeling to the power of this world, whether that be the mob, but ultimately that is the devil, in my opinion. And so this leads then to no truth being in Satan. And so all these contradictions, all the hypocrisy that I was trying to lay out in the beginning, that is always going to be the case, because no truth exists in Satan. No truth exists in Satan. So there's the idea that you're going to find some coherent, logically formulated concept or idea. That's never going. It's all going to be about emotion and the manipulation of emotion through lies. And that's exactly what we see going on now. And the only way you're going to be able to cut through that and see reality for the way that it really is for you to start to cut through your own lies and your own addictions and your own problems and your own attachments to this world. And then that leads to the conversation in regards to objectivity and subjectivity. Because if everything is subjective, well, then there's really no way in which to judge people's opinions and actions as right or wrong. And if that's the case, well, then this whole conversation about following God's will or the mob or good and evil, all these different things, that's not going to be a problem, because it's all subjective. And so this is what shocked me this weekend, is just having conversations with some of my friends, and I'm coming at a totally different place. They know who I am, growing up through high school. They know all the times we partied together, did this or that. A lot of them I haven't seen in 5-10 years. And so they might be familiar with the stuff I did previously in regards to the promotion of drugs and psychedelics and cannabis and all that whole scene. And so they're very familiar with that. But now I come back and I'm promoting Christianity, and I'm promoting a more disciplined lifestyle, and I'm trying to explain to people why that's the case. And I was trying to explain to them what I'm trying to do with my new YouTube channel, and basically use Christianity as a purview, as a perspective, then to analyze the things in which are really being promoted in culture, like the New Age religion, all this different stuff. So what I'm trying to do then, and I'm not the only one, so I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm special here, but I'm just trying to say what I'm trying to do with my YouTube channel is to give a voice to Christianity in today's society, in today's culture. And it was very interesting to see some of the reactions to that, because one, obviously they see, for lack of a better word, the sort of sophistication in which I try to talk about these ideas. So it's not like I'm just haphazardly saying things or saying, oh, you need to become Christian, or thumping people with the Bible. It's a much more nuanced perspective than that. But when I began to talk about objectivity, when I began to try to talk about logos and there being a correct order, well, generally speaking, that's cool. You can talk about nature and reproductivity and fractals and the way nature matches up. And well, look at plants, look at the leaves in our finger palm, our palms and our fingerprints. But then once I start to move that into morality, which is obviously the conclusion, that's why spiritual traditions all have a strict set of morality. That now that starts to step on people's toes, and that's all dependent on there being an objective reality. And so what was really interesting is, again, people's reluctance to give me that ground that there is an objective reality. Now they'll say things as if there are, so they'll make statements of one thing being good, the other thing being bad, and now I'm just always pushing them. They'll say, well, that's better, well, they can't do that, that wouldn't be good. And I said, why is that? Clearly there's a standard, clearly there's an objective reality. even people who are more into engineering, who are interested in the sort of efficiency in which they design things, you would think that they would be more predisposed to at least see objective reality, which I think they do. And I think that's why more conservative people, Christians in general, from the last survey I saw, it was like an article, showed that the academic field which had the most like conservative Christians was engineering. And that's clearly, I mean, to me, that makes logical sense given the presuppositions of there being an order to the universe. And what you're trying to do is discover that order and then build according to that order, according to those laws. So what really blew my mind was then this kind of inability for people to recognize the objectivity of reality, though they did. They did. But once you started to bring that out and show how it connected to all facets of life, well, that means that you begin have to take responsibility for yourself, and that is uncomfortable. And that might mean somebody that you like is in opposition to that order. And now that's a very controversial thing to talk about, right? As it is true with society generally. You can't be critical of anything besides, you know, Western civilization, white people, this or that. So, anyways, that's basically the last thing that I wanted to say. And then I wanted to get into, you know, my friend. So, let me just look real quick, see if I have any questions before I move forward here. At least related to this. Well, just throw me an @ or a super chat. I don't want to. Some of these are totally off topic, so I don't want to go into a new direction. But if you have any questions, super chat me, or at least at Church of the Eternal logo, so at least it pops up so I can see it a lot easier. But now I want to move into sort of my thoughts over this past weekend. So the gentleman that died was a friend. I was actually his first friend when he moved to the town that I live in. So it's called Franklin, Indiana, is where I grew up. But he had moved from a different area in the state. We were both in 4th grade, and we quickly became friends. I always thought he was a very funny individual. He's kind of a chubby kid throughout his entire life. Even at the funeral, multiple people made Chris Farley references. He was always the life of the party. He had tons of impersonations. He could do you know, he had so many different voices he could do. Just a hilarious guy. He did a lot of, you know, the way that Chris Farley kind of used his body, you know, and it was sort of humorous, but yet at the same time, he was very agile. This was my friend. And they didn't necessarily look alike, although their body types were the same. But that's the way he was, and everybody loved him. And so at the funeral, I mean, hundreds of people came out, you know, and I had I had so many memories with that guy. Again, through elementary school, I was literally, if not the one of his first friends moving to the town. And then we went through elementary school together from 4th and 5th grade. We went to middle school together, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And then we went to high school together, and of course graduated together. And always good friends, despite having very different worldviews. I was not worldviews, but lifestyles. I was very much into sports. He was more into the party scene and girls and all this stuff. And he was even on my Bantam League football team. This is these were some of the stories that got rehashed over the weekend with old friends. Again, I mean, I hadn't seen for many years. And so it was tough. He was loved by everybody. But everybody knew that he loved to be intoxicated, and whether in high school, whether that be drinking, this or that, but he was always down to do substances. He was always, interested in getting intoxicated one way or another. And he was always funny, though. He wasn't he was never an angry person. Everybody got along with him until later in his life. And I'm not trying to speak ill about the dead or anything like that. I'm just trying to speak truth and help anybody else. One of the things that I was really praying for while at the funeral, you're seeing so many people you hadn't seen in a very long time, bawling their eyes out. You're seeing somebody who's 30 years old. I couldn't help but keep thinking about that being the age in which Christ began his mission. I was 30 years old when I basically started this YouTube channel. And for me, I have all these plans for the future. And of course, he's laying in that casket. And I just couldn't help but thinking about how my life moving away from, not that I ever got serious. I never got into like serious drugs or anything like that, anything addictive. I was just into cannabis and psychedelic substances. But just by being into that, you're basically accepted within that whole subculture. And I have done basically a 180. And so it was very interesting to kind of see where other people were, you know, and how they were still running down that same path. And this idea of addiction to this world ultimately leads to death. We're all going to die, right? But I feel like my life is just beginning to a degree. I really do. I feel like, you know, we talked about trying to build families, careers. I feel like I have a skill doing what I do in regards to talking about things, conveying ideas, things that I'm passionate about, reading, doing research. And I want to do that for the rest of my life. So for me, it's like this channel is the beginning point of me really trying to do what I want to do with my life. And so there's so much life left. And then I'm looking at him, you know, and he's passed away, and it's tough. So, it led me to thinking about then meaning in general. And so I've already talked about, you know, those four main sources of meaning, but, God being ultimately one of those. And so by following God's will, you create harmonious patterns. But to become addicted to this world, your patterns aren't going to be harmonious. And so even my buddy, you know, we never were no longer friends, but we certainly kind of fell out of, you know, it's not like we texted each other or talked to each other for basically the last 7 years or so. And I didn't know he had been he had been struggling with heroin for that long. Of course, you know, you find out more, or at least I did over the weekend. So I didn't know that was something. And then it didn't really become really serious until the last couple years. But I have an experience in which he came over. So where I grew up, it's kind of a nice close knit neighborhood, and my neighbor happened to be my best friend. So he was a year older. He had we had two older brothers, so there's three boys over there. I only had an older sister. I spent much of my childhood over at my buddy's house. His name's Alex. And so one night we're over there, and one of our mutual friends is actually cousins with the gentleman who passed away. And we all loved that guy. So we said, oh, call him over, you know, see if he wants to come hang out. And again, this is within the last couple years. And, you know, everything was fun. Of course, he got wildly intoxicated. We all were, right? This was something that this was actually probably 3 years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago. And he ended up stealing money. And this was really, really heartbreaking to me. Again, I didn't know how serious his addiction with heroin was, but there was $100 bill that was left in a sort of change drawer at the house. And of course, the person who left it there knew exactly where it was and was expecting to grab that in the morning. And then my buddy, who passed away, having been dealing with his addiction problems, saw that, grabbed that. Next morning, gentleman who actually owned that money says, okay, who took it? I can't find it. I know I set that there. That's where I set my money. Everybody says, well, it's not us. We all knew it wasn't the close group of friends. The only sort of variable that entered the equation was the friend that died. And he, of course, said, no, I would never do that. I would never do that. And eventually, after searching the house, we knew he probably did. And then he goes to the restroom. And after he ended up leaving, we found it. And that really broke my heart, because he was stealing from some of the closest people to him, the people who cared the most about him. He was actually pushing away due to his addictions to this world. And that's what I wanted. And the only reason I bring that up is not to speak ill of the dead, because you guys don't know who it is. So it's not like I'm tying all this to a particular person, but I'm trying to highlight that when you follow God's will, beautiful patterns emerge. And when you have an addiction to this world, whether that be drugs, whether that be sex or power or oneself, the ripple effect of that is always going to be negative. And one ways in which that was negative for my friend is that he literally pushed away those closest to him. And so I was not unique. When I was at the funeral, I couldn't tell you how many people had similar experiences, that within the last couple of years, all his closest friends, not all of them, because he had a lot of other friends, but most of his closest friends were no longer in his life. All the people he grew up with, because he had done them wrong one way or another. And that I'm just highlighting as a pattern of being addicted to this world. And so, we're all struggling with addiction is really the takeaway then, one way or another, to an attachment to this world. And this is why we have to have our orientation, our true north, the legend on our map has to be God. It has to be God. Because without that, you're the slave. You're the slave. If you're not willingly a slave to God, you're a slave to this world. And if you're a slave to this world, then you're ultimately a slave to evil one way or another. And so now I want to talk about areas in which I think people, all of us have to battle this every day. And so the first one I want to talk about is sex, of course, and sex addiction. And that's an addiction in multiple different ways. So one of the easiest ways to think about sex addiction, of course, is like masturbation. And so masturbation and pornography, that this E. Michael Jones talks about how it's like sort of sexual vice is a form of political control. Absolutely agree with that. And because all vices are a form of control, and anybody who's really interested in power knows that, and that's why they want to promote vices, get as many people hooked on a vice as possible, so then they can direct it. Because once you're tied to that vice, you're really, really, screwed to a degree. So pornography and masturbation, I look at it and I look at the demonization of masculinity within society, the difficulty in finding individuals, both for men and women, finding individuals to really create a family with, especially a Christ-centered relationship. And then the prevalence of pornography and how that's pushed on us, how that's normalized, how during the pandemic, right, this was advocated for in a multitude of different ways for people to watch more and more pornography. And I'll tell you, I struggle with all this. Not that I have a problem and do it all the time or anything like that, but just being a red-blooded male. And so anybody who out there is struggling with it, don't think that it's some, thing that only you're doing. Any man is probably struggling with thoughts of lust and sex and all these things, and especially since how early we've been exposed to pornography. I mean, I remember seeing porn when I was a kid. I mean, I was probably like 10 years old. So since then, I've known about it, and you see how that sort of takes away one's innocence to a degree, and how that lust then it's now a factor in one's life, and that's true for so many of us men. And then we see how the pornography is being used to manipulate people. You get on there, and I'm not telling anybody to get on there, so I'm not telling you to do that. But I'm sure those of you who have in the last couple of years have probably seen the rise of like incest and really degenerate forms of sexual behavior, rape, abusive stuff like that. It's a way to alter people's psychology. So I don't know how familiar you guys are if I'm looking into like how you can program people one way or another, but one of them is through sex and masturbation, and that circuitry that's fired for an orgasm. Somebody can fact check me on this, but from my understanding, it's the state in orgasm, like while you're having an orgasm, is one of the most susceptible places in which you can mentally program somebody. And so there's all these myths, at least within mythology, of women saying seductive things to men during that state, this or that. But from things that I've heard, and I don't know how true they are, but this is a point. The state of orgasm is where the corpus callosum, the apparatus that fuses the right and left hemisphere. This is so the right and left brain are most fused during this point of orgasm, and so you can supplant like subliminal messages and stuff like that. The idea is that some of the MK Ultra stuff was hooking people up to electrodes that would put them in a perpetual state of orgasm, so then you could program them one way or another, usually after you've already shattered their psyche through extremely traumatic experiences. Well, once those patterns occur, once you start having orgasms, so masturbating, this or that, watching pornography, and they're putting all the incestual stuff, they're putting the rape, they're putting a multitude of degenerate things, that is, you are in a state as soon as you orgasm to implant that within your own psyche so much easier than any other point of your sort of conscious awake mind. So we see how that is being used to, again, corrupt people's sort of minds, sort of their concepts of sex and relationships, and which ties then to this rise of fetishes, right? Look what the internet has done with fetish, and whether that be feet or furries or even pedophilia. These are all forms of like sexual degenerate fetishes that the society is trying to condone, normalize. Why? Because again, you can control these people so much easier than somebody who's a slave to God and has discipline in their life and won't engage in these things. You can't control that person. You can control the person that has a vice. And so the rise in sexual fetishes, which then leads to something like the OnlyFans, who if you haven't, I highly recommend watching Roosh B's discussion on OnlyFans. He really does a sort of comprehensive analysis of that, which I really liked. So if you hadn't seen that, I do recommend going and checking that out. That's Roosh B on OnlyFans, and how this retrains women. This throws a whole nother wrench into society and how we understand sex and sexual relationships, how we, the whole selling of one's sex and prostitution. I mean, that's essentially what OnlyFans is. So these fetishes then are trying to be pushed on us over and over and over again. And this leads to then just degenerate behavioral patterns in so many aspects of society, which then consumes individual lives. Again, these fetishes, I don't want to get too much into that, but you see where I'm going with it. But that's also tied to, so that is an addiction in itself. So pornography is a sort of addiction already. The way in which then they promote even more, if you can imagine, more degenerate stuff within the pornography, that gets another addiction. Or somebody has a really strange fetish, which only occurs through some sort of experiential experience. So something happened in one's life, whether that be to be a furry, to be attracted to children, to be all these different things. Something got mixed up, something went wrong, something happened, and that circuitry. So I don't know if you guys are familiar, but even with studies that have shown on homosexual men, pedophilia, is that unfortunate for a lot of these young guys that end up having an encounter with a male pedophile and they're a little boy, is that their first orgasm. So think about how much that affects then your brain circuitry is with like an older man. And so that reinforces then that whole culture, that whole idea, and they're so much more likely then to be a pedophile themselves. Because why? Because they're tied, that their first orgasm, they're consciously, it's tied to that experience, it's tied to that context between individuals like that. That's disgusting. And that's why pedophilia is such a terrible sin, because you're really destroying almost someone's soul. It's really, really difficult for somebody who's been molested like that to not fall victim to those same patterns and urges. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say about fetishes. But then people are addicted to other people. this is another form of addiction. Of course, this is tied to sex, and you can be addicted to other people in two ways: maybe a specific individual, or just individuals as tools. And so having many sexual partners is a form of addiction. You're addicted to the pleasure, you're addicted to the thrill. And this is where somebody like Rush B could speak, he could wax more eloquently on this topic than myself. I did read The Game. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it was a book on pickup artistry and stuff like that. But it was by the Rolling Stone, Lee Strauss or something like that. I forget. But that was where it really started to become popular in society. But many partners is a form of addiction due to the thrill of the chase, due to the different experience, due to all these different things. And like I said, just listen to Roche V talk about his experiences on this and how essentially God delivered him out of that. And I truly do think it's a providence. I totally agree with Roche V where he talked about his experience traveling around the country last year. I don't know if you guys saw those videos, his sort of travel logs, how after the end of that, and this was right before the pandemic started to come on and we went under lockdown, is that he felt God was calling his soldiers. And I think that's a really great framework for us to look at what's happening in society, because think of how many men, you guys included, me, we're in totally different places, and how we have been sort of called back to a totally different lifestyle. And I like the idea of soldiers because this really is a war. This really is a spiritual war. And the stakes are really high. So therefore, we have to take more responsibility on ourselves. But anyways, we get addicted to people. One of those is having sex with many people. But another form of that is having, being addicted to individual people. And sometimes we do this in relationships. I'm not talking about that you love somebody. That's not what I'm talking about. That's all great. I'm talking about literally people get addicted to other people, So this is another form of addiction that's almost perpetuated in culture. And this is the way that they sort of sexualize celebrities and stuff like that to get more people addicted to those individuals. And we see sex being used to do that. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's another form of addiction we can see being manifesting in society that's really done deliberately, and that we as Christians need to be conscious of. So some of the things these are not exhaustive. These are just some of the things that were on the top of my mind that I wrote down for today's talk. And so that had to do with, so the addictions that I had written down in regards to sex, pornography, fetishes, many partners, other people, and masturbation. And masturbation being a sort of, it is a sort of very nihilistic, I've never met a guy who has masturbated, especially watching pornography, and actually you feel better afterwards. You never do. You always feel disgusting. You want to get it off your screen as soon as possible. And so it's like, even within us, and then you lose energy. This is a common thing, that you don't have energy afterwards the same way in which you did before. And so, anyways, I just want to highlight that these are forms of addictions and that we have to be careful of, and they will kill you, and they will cause, again, this idea of ripple effects, following God's will versus man's will. Man's will ultimately leads to a submission to Satan's will, the prince of this world, the ruler of the fallen world. And that, we have to take control of these things. So another way in which we're addicted is the image of oneself. And I have a few things I want to say here. The first one is the very obvious one: physical appearance, right? People get addicted to the way they look, and it's a sort of narcissism. It falls into a sort of solipsism, where they're the most important individual in the world. Everything's about the way that they look and they appear, and they become very, very superficial. We all know these people. We've all seen these people. We all see how society then elevates these individuals. And this is something that I think we all need to be aware of. This is something that I think about myself. So I plan on doing some fitness videos here in the near future. I talked to you guys about this before. Well, I take very good care of my body. And I think about sometimes how much superficiality is wrapped up in my own maintenance and efforts in taking care of my body and making it look the way that I think is most ideal. And I'm trying to manage that, because another theme of this video is that if you're following God, it's not that we divorce ourselves from the world. It's that we moderate ourselves in the world, and that our orientation towards God reflects and manifests itself in the world. And so in my mind, I try to maintain my fitness in the way that I look as a icon of the values that I hold, because I do, again, even when I make this YouTube channel, it's like the idea is that I do want to be a role model for young guys. I do want to be a role model for people in which it seems like there's no good role models in society. And I'm not saying that I'm great. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that the standards in which I hold myself up to, I don't mind making that public and trying to be somebody that other people can emulate in the ways in which that are beneficial, right? But all that is because the idea that you would even want to emulate is because it's directed towards God, because God is where the orientation is geared towards. It has to be. And so I want to make this video, especially when we're talking about addiction. It's not like a Buddhist, a detachment from the world. That's not what we do as Christians. We don't detach from the world. We are in the world. God incarnated into the world. So we don't have this animosity towards the physicality or the world itself. Now, unfortunately, the world is fallen, and so we cannot be consumed by the world. We cannot be addicted to the world, but we have to have moderation in all that we do. So the way in which we talk about these topics, so it's not like sex is bad. This is another thing that I've heard in some of the guys online. It's like they act like sex is this really nasty, gross thing. And it's almost like neoteny. It's like a little child, that still thinks girls have cooties. And in a way, it's sort of celebrated online. And I get it. Sometimes it's kind of funny, like the whole women thing. I get it. But at the same time, sex is like a beautiful thing. And I'm not advocating to do that out of wedlock. I'm not saying that at all. I am a fornicator. I've done bad things, but I've also done that with people that I actually cared about, and it's a really beautiful experience. So it's not something to it's not totally negative in and of itself, especially once it's in a marriage. That's when it can be condoned and it's actually a good thing. Same thing with your physical appearance. You need to dress well. You need to take care of your body. You need to present yourself in a way in which other people can see your underlying values being expressed. But we can't become addicted to that. That's the thing. The addiction is the problem, and then that's going to manifest itself in all these bad behaviors. So another one that I wanted to say that I think most people, maybe they don't initially think of, but I think you guys will agree with me here, is moral superiority. And one of the things that I was talking to one of my friends this past weekend who is much more aligned with sort of new age ideology, stuff like that. And we were talking about the idea that you are the universe. And so this whole Alan Watts concept where you are the universe looking back at itself. And I said, isn't it so funny that those who actually believe that worldview say that they are the ones without the ego? And he agreed. And I said, now tell me, what statement could a person make that would be more egoish than to say that they are God and they are the pinnacle of creation itself? And you can't. And so there's an internal contradiction. There's a hypocrisy even in the worldview of the psychedelic culture, the new age culture, the sort of Eastern spirituality culture in Western society, that this absence of ego, that they're not attached to the world. But really, what are they attached to? They're so attached to their own ego and their own perception of moral superiority that they can't even see it. And it's incredible. I mean, you can't really think of anything that'd be more egoistic than to think that you are the epitome of creation and you are God, and that there is no higher authority than you, your individual self, which then ties back to the conversation I had earlier with objectivity versus subjectivity. And why then we see culture just moving more and more into a subjective world, because it validates all these things. And this is again why we have to be followers of God, the Logos, God, the Trinity, Christianity, Jesus Christ, because we have to have our goals transcend creation itself, but we don't leave creation. All this stuff is rippled through creation so they can see our values. And so another way in which we're addicted is obviously the covetousness of things, the image of oneself. So it's not like I'm telling any of you guys, and I know orthodoxy is a little bit tricky because of the way in which it sort of elevates the ascetic lifestyle and monasticism as a way in which you get closer and closer to God. Agreed with. I'm not trying to disagree with that. And maybe I should have this discussion with somebody who's clergy of one way or another. I'll bring it up to Father Deacon Ananias. We're actually having a conversation this Thursday evening, this coming Thursday. So 2 days, we're going to be talking about Logos. But I don't think it's a sin to want nice things. It's a sin to be addicted to nice things. It's a sin to then base one's value on nice things. But, the whole verse in Matthew about getting a camel through the eye of the needle, it's not that we have to be millionaires or billionaires or anything like that, but to have a nice car or multiple cars, to have, a nice wife, a nice family, nice things, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. But we can't be addicted to it. We can't make that the ultimate value. And again, so that's going to be related to moderation and following God and really trying to do what's best and then allowing God to bless you. And I don't mean a prosperity gospel, because that's not what I mean at all. In fact, I don't know if you guys saw Joel Osteen out protesting with BLM in I think it was Houston. So anyways, I just want to say that I'm not saying to not have nice things. I'm just saying that we can't covet things. We need to, we just need to keep that in mind and always keep the orientation on God, and then allow ourselves to represent these values in different things that we do. And that also means maintaining things, keeping things nice, in nice order, nice condition. Same thing with the clothes, the way you dress, the way you look, stuff like that. And so the last one is congratulations for others. This is another addiction within the image of oneself. And so this is just social media, right? And that's kind of tied to the thumbnail that I used for today's video, is that people are addicted to the gratification and the self-congratulations they get from the internet. And that is a real problem. That is a real addiction. And that's the whole selfie culture, right? I mean, selfies themselves is a sort of a validation of self-worship. Now, I'm not saying to not take selfies. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, okay, take your example. I'm sure some of you guys saw this past weekend, like social media influencers taking pictures as if they're helping put buildings back together, standing in front of rioted, looted companies, businesses. And this was all just for the gram. This was all just for social media, just to get the perception of other people to think of them in a certain way, which is then tied to the addiction to moral superiority. And then it's tied to the addiction of self-congratulations and gratification through the internet, through social media. Now, this, I think, is a real one, because I think I don't know, but it feels like it's drastically altered the way in which we can date. That social media and, it seems like, I'm speaking generalistically here. I know I'm not totally accurate, but it seems like it's so difficult to find a very beautiful girl that has traditional values because of how much dopamine, how much gratification they can get by posting images of themselves online. And so this, I think, has had a major ripple effect in society. And again, it's never going to be good if it's not God-centered. And I don't see a lot of the social media stuff as being God-centered. In fact, I see it being man-centered, and therefore ultimately being of the guidance of the devil, right? So social media and the gratification of oneself through other people through, likes and clicks. And I myself am on the internet. I make videos. I want people to like the video. I want people to listen to what I have to say. But at the same time, I'm very conscious and deliberate to not think that my value is wrapped up in what I do online. And plus, what I'm doing online, because it's so small, but I try not to let any of that go to my head, because one, it's sort of heady. What the conversations we have on here, it's not for a mass audience. So I don't, I think that I can fall victim to this just like anybody else. I have an ego. I like to, it's just like a J. Dyer. Anybody who goes and tries to start speaking, I've been speaking for an hour and 19 minutes. You have to have somewhat of an ego to think that you even have something to say in the first place. So any of us can fall victim to this stuff. It's just, I try to be very conscientious about it. And now, another one that I want to talk about is intoxication. This is another form of addiction that we all need to watch out for. And the first one is how intoxication can lead to the sort of bubbling up of emotions and false meaning. And what I say by that is, I'm sure all of us have drank, alcohol to a point of inebriation, or we smoked weed, or done psychedelics, or done whatever, pick your poison, whatever substance you've chosen. But emotions come up, memories come up, you feel certain ways, you think, oh, this is great, you're having a good time, you're high, whatnot. And we begin to think that somehow this is meaningful. And, unfortunately, this is where I think it relates to my buddy, because of where he was in his life. And what I didn't mention was, I think 5 years ago, his mother died of cancer. And so even though he had been using heroin for a while, I didn't know about it. But after his mother died, that's when things really got going and really amplified. And he started going down a worse place. And you can see how certainly the despair of your mother dying, something like that, could shoot somebody in that direction. But to replace that with the sort of feelings and emotions you get from being high, that's going to be a problem. It's because it's always going to be a lack of real meaning, because that meaning is so brief, right? As soon as you come off the drug, that meaning, what you were looking for, is no longer there, and now you're back into the world in which you were trying to escape in the first place. So one of the ways in which people are addicted to intoxication, it's not just the drug. People don't always get addicted to the drug. They get addicted to the feeling. They get addicted to the emotions. They get addicted to, the next one. This is one that I was addicted to. Performance enhancers. The idea that somehow drugs allow you to do things. And so the whole movie of the limit of Limitless, right? Where the guy has the drug and he can learn and do all these things at a level that he couldn't do without it. And then eventually you see how he, the mass addiction, and ultimately he can't live without this substance. And I sort of got caught up in that during my master's degree. So during my undergraduate, I would buy Adderall and stuff whenever I had a big exam. First, I was a biology major, then I got into religion. And if I had a big exam coming up, I would like to try to find some Adderall, this or that, and then you could stay up, especially the biology exams, the science exams, whether you're in immunology or cell biology or whatever it was, organic chemistry. So you have to do all this study, and then you can go and buy these pills, and then they allow you to do all this studying, and you could get good grades. And so I saw myself getting good grades in college, when in high school, I didn't try to get good grades. I was an athlete. And so this new perception of myself as an intellectual, an academic, this or that, was almost tied to then using certain things. And that carried up into my master's degree. And I was taking Adderall all the time because, again, I thought that without it, I wouldn't be able to compete at this sort of higher intellectual level. And that was a form of addiction. Now, I don't think I was addicted to the pills or anything. I was addicted to the idea that I was better with them, and therefore I could accomplish more And my perception of myself was tied to that person who was on those substances, right? And Adderall's, so many people are prescribed to it, so it's not like the craziest substance to take. There's not a whole lot of detriments. You do it once or twice, you're going to get a lot of energy, it'd be hard to go to sleep, this or that. But that was something that I ended during my master's degree, is that I realized that I was tied, the concept of myself was so tied up in like reading long periods of time. I was like, man, I can't get through all these books without these drugs. And then I gave all that stuff up, realized that I could still do it. And that was a real, benefit to myself, obviously, both physically, but just in sort of like my own self-confidence. And so that's why I wanted to highlight is that performance enhancing, the idea of intoxication. People get addicted to the idea that they are performance enhancers, whether that be even the use of psychedelics for like visionary art, new ideas. And I would say this was really what I was addicted to in regards to psychedelics. It's not that, because psychedelics are not addictive. You don't do psychedelics all the time. If you do, you probably got a problem that's way more serious than just using psychedelics. But you get addicted to the idea that you can go into these mental spaces and somehow acquire ideas, acquire new perceptions, acquire new perspectives that are going to benefit you in your life. And so therefore they're tools, but they're spiritual tools, they're intellectual tools. This is how then you begin to frame it. And I know I certainly got to that place where now I was addicted to the idea that I could take these substances, I could, go off by myself, because usually I did them all by myself, and I would just sit and think for hours. That's literally what I did, and that's what I love to do. I would, whether it be LSD or mushrooms, I would just sit for hours by myself just thinking about ideas. And that was my big passion. So, I just say all that because I think that is another form of addiction. Now, in regards to addiction and intoxication, I think somatic escape, and this is going to tie back to more of my buddy and his addiction to heroin as a bodily escape from the world. I never got into drugs to escape the world. Again, when I say drugs, that's a very big umbrella term. Again, for me, that's just cannabis and psychedelics. But for my buddy who just passed, I would say the heroin, it's an escape from, the fact that he lost his mom, the fact that he didn't have the best life growing up, that he wasn't close with his biological father, that he wasn't where he wanted to be, that, he was, a funny thing about him, he never got a license. He was 30 years old, never got a license, always bummed rides off people. Which shows you two things. One, the sort of, to a degree, the lack of self-accountability, but how much people like to be around him, that people wanted to give him a ride, that he could literally get around as an adult without ever having a license. So I think that's kind of funny, but I say a somatic escape is a form of addiction, is that drugs can be used then to escape reality, and that is a real form of addiction that is way beyond any physical addiction, although he was obviously wrapped up into the physical addiction with heroin. But I'm just saying that we have multiple addictions that we all need. The whole point of this video is just to highlight things we can become addicted to and be conscientious of that. And then the another form of addiction in regards to intoxication, and this would have been true for me, again, in regards to psychedelics, is novel experiences. The sort of newness of things. And so you can take psychedelics to do that. I'm sure you can take a lot of different drugs to do that. And novelty becomes an addiction. And that's not just an addiction in drugs, that becomes an addiction in all facets of your life. So now you're addicted to the new phone, you're addicted to the new shoes, you're addicted to new everything. Newness is an addiction. That is a real thing. And I think in regards to the sort of addiction to novelty in regards to intoxication, a sort of sober way in which that is manifest. Terrence McKenna used to talk about how the closest thing to a psychedelic trip is to take a trip. a physical trip, they travel. And that traveling, by taking yourself out of your own sort of cultural context, moving into a new cultural context, one that maybe you're not very familiar with, and now your senses are heightened. You're seeing all these different things. They're coming at you. They're zooming by, and that this is why then the hippies, the 1960s counterculture, called them trips, because you're going somewhere and you're coming back. And that travel itself, I love to travel. But I think that can also become a sort of addiction that tied to a general concept of novelty, right? We're always looking for new things. Therefore, we're always looking to travel. We're always looking for the newest and latest and greatest. We have to watch out for that. That's all I'm saying, is that we need to watch out for that. And then the last area of addiction that I wanted to talk about was power. And this is probably the most obvious, right? And that people become addicted to sort of political and institutional power. I think one of the areas, political, we don't even have to go into that, a la history itself, whether you're talking about communism or all the different forms of empire, this or that, any of the rulers, most people had a sort of addiction to power one way or another. But institutional power, I think, is an interesting one to think about in our contemporary context, because you can look at something like a Google, who was very new, right? When they first started, a sort of up and coming thing. They had their search. Google was just they had their Google search, and then they had that phrase, what was it? Don't be evil or something like that. And you see how they have become one of the most manipulative and evil forces on the planet. And I say that on a Google platform right now. I'm using Chrome, I'm on YouTube, and I'm using an Apple product to live stream right now. So I'm sort of indebted in a way to their products. I'm using their products, but we see the addiction to power that they have, and now that we're seeing with all the censorship. And this is really maniacal, in my opinion. This is a serious level of trying to manipulate society, again, which is going to be tied to, again, moral superiority, right? I talked about addiction to one's own ego and moral superiority. So how many people at Google, how many people in the sort of progressive left are really addicted to their own ego, so much so that they're always talking about not having an ego? Because by talking about not having ego, it validates the ego, that's saying that they're not that person. But the idea that somehow their opinion is more important on society, and it should be enacted through search results and censorship of videos. Unfortunately, recently one of our Ortho brothers, Jay Dyer, he got his channel demonetized. Why? Why? And it's really because it's too much truth in opposition to the powers that be. And like I said earlier, there is no truth in Satan. And if you're going to go on, or you're going to go into the world and try to speak truth and try to even talk about God and do God's will, it's never going to end well, because that's not the nature of the fallen world. And most people are part of that mob, right? They're always going to choose Barabbas. And so, institutional power, I think is really, really interesting. Now, I don't know if you guys have been following Owen Benjamin and Box Day's lawsuit with Patreon, but at least from what I've heard and sort of the most recent discussion from Box Day, it seems like this could really change the tide in some of the online censorship. Though that, what I'm talking about is addiction to power, and I'm talking about it at an institutional level. So certainly the university, this is what prompted me to create my YouTube channel. The university is terrible. The university is totally enamored with its own power to censor or to be the purveyor of knowledge, only those things in which you're allowed to talk about. So try to talk about race and IQ in the university. Good luck with that. Try to talk about biological sex and gender. Not going to end well. Try to talk about the preservation of Western civilization or Christendom as a central force within culture. Not going to let you have it. So the addiction to power is another addiction and entrapment of this world that we see in so many different ways. Now, another addiction in regards to power, I think, is influence, right? Everybody wants to be an influencer, and this is one where I have to, I think about. This is why I come up with the idea when I go through these. I think influence, wanting to influence, can become an addiction. The idea that one's own opinion, one's own thoughts you can push this out into the world, and it actually causes things to move, right? Things alter due to one's own opinion. That is certainly an addiction. And I think ultimately, of course, that's tied to a sort of a concept of power, but that's a real addiction. And we have to watch out for that. But I think we can see it play out in so many different ways in society that, it's fairly obvious. So when you look at then influencers, you look at, the Paul brothers, you look, and then look at the degeneracy they fall into, because there's always these ripple of patterns, right? As soon as you become addicted to the world, the patterns that are going to emerge are not going to be beneficial. They're not going to be harmonious. They're not going to be ordered, because order comes from the logos itself. So the only way that you can have beautiful, organized, ordered patterns in your life in so many aspects is to follow God. And if you're not following God, you're not going to get that order. And so it's just really interesting then to look at the sort of degeneracy that emerges with online influencers due to their addiction to influence. And I think they really do influence. I got some young nieces, they're in middle school now. In the fall, one will be a junior, the other two will be freshmen. And so to see the influence that some of these online influencers have, it's real influence, and we need to, I guess, educate young people better. But I just wanted to highlight that the addiction to influence is an addiction to power as well. That it's just good to keep in mind, to look to. So the last one then, in regards to the addiction to power, is the control over free will. And that's going to be tied to the sort of institutional power, because it's not just wanting to be the CEO at Google is the problem. Is that Google itself wants to control free will. Now that is heinous. Why? Because we are made in the image of God, at least within Orthodox theology. One of the most obvious ways in which we're made in the image of God is due to our free will. And without free will, of course, you don't have sin. Without free will, there is no objective reality. There can be, of course, some people try to take that and the Sam Harrises of the world try to lead you to determinism or something, which is totally illogical. But the control of free will is sinister. And that's what we're seeing in regards to these social media companies. That's what we're seeing in regards to our political leaders, both on the left and right. This is, one of the things about COVID, one of the things about the more recent events out of Minneapolis is we see how complacent and how willful many of our political leaders are to the exact opposite of what is good. What is good, and that really what they want to do is control free will. And so again, the search results, the censorship, all that stuff, I think is ultimately a controlling of free will, which is evil. So to conclude this video, we have to follow the logos. The logos is the source of truth. Truth is a who, not a what. We have no sense of north without God. Our north has to transcend creation itself. That's the only way to not be addicted to the world. And even to use the word to be addicted to God, I don't think is totally accurate, because I don't know if the definition of addiction should be applied to following God's will itself. So I don't know if I would say that, but we must follow God. We must always be trying to do that in order to transcend creation itself. Our goal, our legend with on the map of created reality, our true north has to transcend creation. And therefore, once we do that, it can emanate itself in all these different aspects of our lives. By following God, that's ultimately going to lead to a moderation of this world. So by putting the logos first, by following God, you aren't going to succumb to these same addictions as most people do. Why? Because by doing that, you're already going to be much more likely to moderate your activity in all these different directions. So all these different things, you're going to at least be more conscientious of. Read more scripture, pray more. These are going to be extremely beneficial to, then you'll see a ripple effect in your own life of a more moderating force in regards to all these worldly temptations. And so what results then from following God, which leads to moderation, from moderating your attachment to this world, leads to then beautiful patterns. And beautiful patterns and beauty, I believe, is objective. Aesthetics are objective. This would be something that my friends over the weekend, they would certainly push back on because of their emphasis on subjectivity, which I believe is really an emphasis on relativism, which really leads to a sort of emphasis on the dethroning of God. That is a real problem. But when we follow God, the results are beautiful. And what I mean is, if we're truly following God, we need to be taking care of our bodies, because our bodies are our temples. So then we have beautiful bodies. We take care of our families. We take care of our relationships. We speak, we don't lie to people. So if you really care about somebody, don't tell a lie. Even if it's an uncomfortable truth, not always, you don't. If you have a loved one, you have a wife, you have a girlfriend, there's some things you don't want to say just to cause problems. But generally speaking, I'd say 99% of the time, speak truth. Just be honest. And honesty, even though it might be awkward in certain circumstances, that leads to a beauty in regards to the patterns it creates. One's own life and legacy is a form of art. I mean, your life is a gift from God. And if you're not following your skill, then what are you doing? What are you doing? Like, you're not going to have the more important parts of meaning. You're not going to be that icon of God, right? That's what we talk about so many times, as being an icon of Christ, being an icon of God. That we need to do that. We have to do that, and our lives can be beautiful works of art, again, by following God. And that would lead to a legacy. And we want to have legacies. There's nothing wrong with having it doesn't mean, maybe some of you guys may end up being saints or something. I have no idea. But there's nothing wrong with being conscientious about your reputation and the way you treat people. Like, I want people, when they go to my funeral, that they're going to think about how I treated everybody. That's important. That's worth more than money. That is a ripple effect, again, from putting God first. We all want that. And that's really the last thing I just wanted to say, is thinking about the beauty, the ripple effect of beauty that is created from following God. So that's the last thing. Looks like we got a couple super chats here, so I will pull those up. Let me check them out. Cool. Thank you guys for anybody who super chatted. We got Drunken Warlock says, "Oh, what do you think of the toll houses?" You must have saw the tweet I put out a while back and got hammered by some of the ortho guys online. I read so there's a Greek monastery, I believe, in Arizona, who's sort of written the ultimate book on toll houses. I have not read that book. I do not own that book. Now, I've read Father Seraphim Rose's book. I've spoke with Dyer. I have a couple writings actually in opposition to toll houses. I don't have really a definitive opinion on them. I know I've read Father Rose's book. I know what he says. And I just want to learn more about it, because I've been learning, I've been reading the different opinions. This is not a dogma within the church. It doesn't mean it's not the historical perception. I do find, if you read Father Rose's book, he uses some examples that seem like, oh, well, that's clearly some of the church fathers are advocating for toll houses, like a John Chrysostom is often cited. Then I have a work trying to debunk toll houses, which then is also using aspects of John Chrysostom's theology to say how that would be counter. I'm not sure. Now, if you're familiar with, like, the icon that's used for toll house is actually the Dormition icon. It's the idea that Christ came to receive the Mother of God and take her back to heaven to avoid the toll houses. I want to do more research myself. Dyer and I were going to have a conversation, but we decided to do something a little bit more fun on the mystical theology. So the toll houses, it's interesting because I've heard multiple clergy in opposition to toll houses, and also the guy who has the Orthodox channel. What is it called? It's the one where he draws everything out. He's somewhere in Eastern Europe. I forget which country. He has really, really good videos. Where what is that? I forget. It's like animated Christianity or something. He's Orthodox, has a bunch of videos. He is in opposition to toll house. I would recommend watching his video if you want to hear the opposite opinion. I don't have a definitive opinion. I'm sort of on the fence. I still want to do more research, but if you wanted to hear the opposite opinion, because most people have read Father Rose's book, most people, at least from the young guys, at least from my perspective that I've seen, are in favor of toll houses. If you want to hear the opposite opinion, look up the guy who animates stuff, and maybe you guys can put his name in the chat. Bible Illustrated, that might be it. Bible Illustrated. Hold on, let me check real quick, just so. Yeah, he's Serbian. Yep, I agree. So if you want Bible Illustrated, if you want to check out he does not. So if you want to see his opinion, watch his video. It's. I'm not telling you to agree with it. I'm just saying if you want to hear the other opinion, just check it out. So, anyways, thank you very much, Drunken Warlock, for your $2. I really appreciate that. And any more questions? Hans Hermann Hope says, so would you endorse Stoicism as a cure for the modern ills we face, but in terms of a traditional Christian light? I'm thinking Orthodox Catholic. I don't think we need to endorse Stoicism, because Orthodoxy, and if you want to say Catholicism, I guess, given its historical roots, I think Christianity takes the best out of Stoicism and then leaves all the pagan garbage behind. So if you mean, do men need to become more stoic? Are there more stoic qualities that are already embedded within Christianity that we need to exemplify more? I definitely agree. One of them is to becoming less emotional. Why? Because emotion, as I talked about, being addicted to emotion and drugs, but then how do you manipulate somebody with lies other than you're manipulating their emotions one way or another, or just their train of thought, their reason process, you're manipulating that. But emotions are part of this world. Doesn't mean they're bad. Doesn't mean they're always good. So I think men becoming more stoic in the way that they approach reality is a very positive thing that would have a great deal positive impact on society, generally speaking. I mean, look how emotional a lot of men are. And so I think that would actually be a good thing. But you don't need to adopt Stoicism for that. You can just adopt Christianity, generally speaking, but Orthodoxy specifically. Become Orthodox. So, let's see. Owen said, can tell you've watched EMJ's video from yesterday with those two black guys and the white dude with the beard. Yeah, with Peter. And then Owen sends £5. Thank you, brother, so much. Guys, go check out, well, it says Eugen. That's a Germanic form of Owen, I believe. But check out Owen's Telegram. You should post your Telegram right now so people can join. If you guys are interested in Orthodox news, the Orthodoxy online community, follow his stuff. He has a Twitter handle. Put in your Twitter handle, man, in the chat so people can see it. He's doing great work in terms of organizing, like trying to have a presence of Orthodoxy as a community. And everybody that watches my stuff needs to support his stuff. He's doing really good work in terms of his Telegram channels, in terms of his Twitter, always putting out news in regards to what's going on in the sort of Orthodox world. So Owen, Eugen, thank you, brother, for all that you do. He always helps me out. He's always sharing my stuff. We message a lot, so he's always shooting me ideas and stuff like that. So I really appreciate you, brother. Thank you. Oh, dude, and you sent two more. He sent two more pounds. Ban pornography. Agreed. Absolutely agreed. It's been an extremely corrosive force in our society. It's been a corrosive force for then sexual relationships, and the sort of pushing the boundaries or the excitement level of sex itself, or again, which is going to tie into all the fetishes, which is going to be tied to all the sort of degenerate forms of fetishes and sexuality. So I absolutely agree that if we ban pornography, if I believe, isn't there a particular country in the Middle East that doesn't allow pornography? Is that Israel? Be interesting. So another super chat by Boneman 538, $14.99. Thank you very much, brother. I really appreciate that. It says, love you, spot on, preach, patter equals patterns. Oh, I love the wordplay there. Patter equals patterns. The Father equals patterns. Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And thank you, brother, for supporting. And anybody who's watching, again, if you would like to support, please go to my website, davidpatrickcarey.com, churchoftheeternallogos.com, and you can set up monthly recurring payments if you're financially able right now. That would be a great benefit. Now, this week, I'm expecting to get my store finished, so there's some merchandise, some t-shirts. I got some really cool Orthodox t-shirts designs coming out, so I should have that up by the end of the week. That is the goal, at least. But trying to really build out my website. I don't know if you guys saw, but Jay Dyer, he shared a video of a big conference call. He was on a huge Zoom call. He was on with a bunch of different online creators, a lot of people in the sort of truth community. So a lot of them aren't Christian. Some of them are Christian. Of course, Dyer's an ortho guy like us, one of the head ortho bros, right? So, and by the way, if you haven't checked his debate out with the Muslim guy, destroyed. Might want to check that out. But anyways, Dyer, he was in this big conference call, and they were talking about how to go about doing social media, trying to create content in today's world. And it's all about building a website. So I'm trying to build out my website. If you are interested, I'm going to start doing more blog posts, but I want to create more content and get people to start going there more frequently. So if you haven't checked it out, go to davidpatrickcarey.com, churchoftheeternallogos.com, and if you're financially able, please consider doing a monthly donation with the donate button at the top right corner. So thank you guys. Oh, and Boneman 538 said another one. Thank you, brother. $3.99. He says, Sephiromus equals archetype of Mother of God. Agreed. Thank you very much, brother. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that generosity in your donations. Just scrolling through here, I see some people added me. Owen said, the veneration of sports figures is something very prevalent in today's society. Oh, this player is my hero. For what? Kicking a ball. True. But also, there's more to it. I mean, one of the reasons why we love sports figures is, again, for the discipline and effort it takes to being great at something. And sports are live. And so, even though I totally agree with you, like the whole ball culture has really dumbed down society and allowed them to be more manipulated, I respect excellence. So if you are an incredible athlete and you're incredibly skilled at one sport or another, I do think that's fairly interesting. But that doesn't mean you're very smart. So then you get somebody like a LeBron James who starts talking. You're like, what the? This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Incipital says, will you do a talk with Subdeacon Mark again? Yeah, Subdeacon Mark and I are actually going to be doing the triads, Gregory Palamas. Yeah, so we're going to be going over the triads here soon. He's been very busy with church and life, and I've been busy with life and the channel and school, and so we just haven't been able to connect in the last few weeks. But we will be doing a long live stream on Gregory Palamas, so definitely keep that in mind. And again, I'm doing one with Father Deacon Ananias this Thursday. And then Owen said, sell your car and ride a horse, revolt against the modern world. I'll let you do that first, but certainly would love to live a sort of country lifestyle where I could have a horse and ride it regularly. That would be great. Will Ford said, can see you starting a clothing line as supplemental income, get everyone waiting in line for them new logos to drop. And then logos. For sure, brother. I actually have some really cool designs, and they're orthodox. Like I got this really cool silhouette of an Orthodox church, and then it says "Got Church," and then it says "Logos" in Greek. So some people might like that, but I do want to come out with some pretty cool stuff that actually represents orthodoxy or Christianity, and just cool stuff. So it'd be another way to contribute to what I'm trying to do here online if you guys like it. So somebody else said recommended reading Departure of the Soul by St. Anthony's Monastery. Yeah, that's the book. Prefer the opinion of church fathers, saints, and apostles, not YouTubers. But John Anon, that's not accurate. So to have the assumption that just because that book was written, that monastic book, there's a lot of clergy within Orthodoxy that don't believe in toll houses. So that's again why you need to have a more nuanced perspective on this stuff and actually know what the what's the internal conversation within the church, because it's much more nuanced and it's much more complicated than just Father Seraphim Rose and St. Anthony's Monastery book. Of which you have to know the other opinion of why they critique that. If you don't, well, then you're going to kind of be in the dark and just be choosing a team. But though I'm not saying that book isn't right, I'm just saying you want to know the history of this debate because it's been going on for a minute. This isn't a new thing. Okay. And cool. Oh, anybody have any more questions? There are a lot of clergy who are wrong. That is true. That is true. There are a lot of clergy, which is clear by the Archbishop of Goarch. I don't know how many guys you saw him marching with protesters. Meanwhile, you can't go to church. Can't go to church, but he can go march in Brooklyn, New York with a bunch of protesters shoulder to shoulder. Something isn't right here. And so that guy really rubs me the wrong way. I don't know if you guys saw that, but I can't stand the Archbishop of Goarch right now. You could have said the same thing during Arianism. Sure, but Arianism is a much more defined. That's a violation of a dogma. Toll houses are not a violation of a dogma one way or another. So again, we need to have a more nuanced opinion of this stuff. And I'm not telling you which side to go on because I want to do more reading. I haven't read St. Anthony Monastery's book. I've read Father Rose's. I've read a lot of the stuff online. And I've read two sources of the opposite opinion, though I wanted to see the critiques of both sides because I want to get both perspectives. So, one of them saying this is a Russian influence, this is a pietistic Russian development. Another one saying, no, this is tied to Pahulo in Canada and some more Americanized forms of Orthodox who aren't recognizing the historicity of toll houses. I'm not telling you to take an opinion, but this debate has been going on for a while. And so it's a little bit different than Arianism because this isn't violating a major dogma or anything like that. That's why, it's so contentious because basically you can be Orthodox without believing in toll houses. Though I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just telling you that that's kind of the state of things right now. Self-pity and that which is comfortable emotionally is warm. It's hard to challenge the carnal mind when you aren't motivated. New England. Right. Well, Drunken Warlock, that's one of the criticisms of people who are against the toll house is that it's a monastic and Russian influence. I'm not telling you that. I'm just saying that's their critique. So, and then the sources that are cited are often the same people. I'm not telling you to take a side. I'm just saying that the conversation's interesting. And if you haven't read some of the opposite opinions that aren't in favor of it, it might be useful to look into, and maybe it'll bolster your opinion up for toll houses. Again, I haven't read St. Anthony Monastery's book yet. So I haven't had the ability to really take the strongest form of the toll house arguments and then compare that to whatever the strongest argument against the toll houses are, just so I can understand it. Because there's some aspects in the theology, the people who are in opposition to it have theological opinions for it. Now, I'm not saying that they're right. I'm just saying that this is a complex debate. That's why I don't want to take an opinion, because I was trying to find out, if it's a dogma or not. It's not. So don't use me as a source, but I'm just telling you to look into it. But it seems like Drunken Warlock, if you have the St. Anthony Monastery book, then you have something that I don't have. I have not had access to that yet. There's no saints on the anti-toll houses side. Well, not according to the people who don't believe in toll houses, because they use all the same saints. So that's not exactly true. But they might be wrong. I'm just saying that to phrase it that way isn't genuine from the opposite perspective. So you got to steel man their argument to really do justice to anything. Do you think we should start advocating people to leave Go Arch and join Orthodox churches instead if they're going to abuse their power? I actually do. Owen, I actually do think we should advocate people to get out of Go Arch. One, because as a catechumen, you can just pay $125 and you can become chrismated. Is that not simony? That seems like simony to me. I mean, Simon Magus in Acts, he wants to pay the apostles to have the Spirit and be able to lay on hands. It sounds like in Go Arch that if you can just pay $125 and you can be chrismated into the church, that is simony. That is a heresy. That's a big time. So I think Go Arch is doing a lot of things that are troubling, though. I saw the Greek Orthodox Church in Chicago come out against some of the protests, and so they that guy was speaking, was super base, speaking truth. So it's not the whole church. Of course, the top of the structure right now, at least in America, it seems pretty subverted, but everything's just more complicated. Nothing's black and white. So, yeah, it's very interesting times. But I do recommend maybe those who are getting into Orthodoxy. I don't recommend going into Go Arch. And for those who are in RoCor, props to RoCor. They definitely, they definitely had the best opinion on what's going on. John Anand says St. Anthony's Monastery book has over 1,000 pages of historical text. Scholars, right? No, I know, brother. I know what the book is. I'm quite aware. I think you are a very sincere guy, and will conclude that toll houses are dogma once you look into it. My own priest in the OCA was telling me they're fake, but I went down the rabbit hole. Okay, well, maybe I haven't gone down the rabbit hole as deep as you have, Drunken Warlock. So, that's why I don't want to take an opinion, because I'm still getting into it, and I've seen the nature of this debate is a little bit more complex. Right now, it's still over my head. There's a lot of sources that are cited that I'm not familiar with. So I agree. It's very possible that once I go further down, I might, I'll take it. Eventually, I'll take a definitive opinion on the toll houses. Just right now, I just want to learn more about it, and I need to get that St. Anthony Monastery's book. Do you guys know how much that book is, by the way? Drunken Warlock or John Anand, do you guys know how much was that book when you got it? Do you guys know? Waiting for Drunken Warlock or John Anand. How much is the St. Anthony Monastery book? Just curious. Almost became atheist. Whoa, did I miss something here? The Russian church is really attractive to me. I spent my college years in a Carpatho-Russian church, which reinvigorated my faith. Oh, awesome. Yeah, RoCor is based. RoCor is definitely based. I loved how they compared it to the Bolsheviks. That definitely caught my eye. Yeah, but no one is perfect. John Anand says like $60 on Amazon. Okay. Yeah, well, that's affordable. I'll get the St. Anthony Monastery book, and I'll go down that rabbit hole. Is there other sources? I mean, really, the books in regards to people reference, it's just Seraphim Rose and the St. Anthony Monastery's book is mostly what people reference. But I'll definitely, for only $60, it's worth getting. Well, does anybody have any more questions before I bounce out of here? Feel free to ask. Real Core has real masculine men and real feminine women. That's awesome. I do not know how to meet women, Orthodox women. That seems to be an elusive creature out on the loose right now. It's currently unavailable on Amazon. Oh, dang. The Future Life According to the Orthodox Teaching by Constantine. Okay. All right, I'll keep that in mind. The Future Life According to Orthodox. Very short book. Awesome. We all need prayers. Greek old believers looking really good. No. I am not going to judge any Christian whether they're good or bad. I just know some of the things that I've seen coming out of Go Arch are very troubling, but I'm sure it's filled with tons of incredible people and great Christians. So I'm not in, I have no idea what's in their heart. Only God does. I'm just speaking in regards to some of the clergy that I've seen. So I'm really troubled by the simony that you can pay to be chrismated, and the archbishop. Those are what trouble me. Outside that, I don't have a whole definitive opinion, but the channel is called Ella Angel. I found it easily searching this. Okay. And yeah, I definitely will, Hans Gruber. I'll check it out. Don't worry. Pano, can we link up? I live in Northwest Indiana and we'll move to Indy, says Was. Oh, dude, for sure. Yeah, I didn't know you're in Indiana. Pano, yeah. Dude, let me know if you're in Indy sometime. We'll grab a lunch or something. Valhalla St. Joseph. Probably Chris, the next comedian. Okay. Yeah, all right. Take it easy, Drunken Warlock. And life and death. Okay. Thank you, John and On. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming and checking out the video, hanging out in the live chat. Again, if anybody has the ability, check out my website, and would greatly appreciate any donation if you could. It's in the top right corner, that button. So please check out davidpatrickcarey.com, churchoftheeternallogos.com, and yeah, feel free to email me, churchoftheeternallogos@gmail.com. And don't forget that Thursday night, we're doing a live stream with Father Deacon Ananias right here on this channel. And we're going to be getting into Logos theology. So those of you who are interested in Heraclitus, some of the Stoicism stuff, Plato and forms, and then how Christianity uses Logos, and then how Orthodoxy in their understanding of Logos is different from other forms of Christianity. So we're going to let Father Deacon Ananias take us to school and talk about philosophy and theology, all in regards to Logos. So that should be good. All right. All right. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. Oh yeah. Oh, and yeah, I do need to add my Telegram. I'll do that one of these days. Okay. All right, guys. Well, take it easy. Again, you will see me Thursday night with Father Deacon Ananias right here on Church of the Eternal Logos. And we're going to be, Katie, we haven't set a time yet. That's the only thing. Just keep an eye out for Thursday. I'll go ahead and make the live stream. But Father Deacon has not set a specific time yet. He's a very busy guy. We just have decided that it's going to be Thursday night, but we're not sure what time yet. So keep an eye out for the live stream when it posts on Thursday, and it will say it'll probably be sometime in the evening, but he's on West Coast time. So I don't know where you're at, Katie. I'm on East Coast time, so I'm imagining it's probably going to be like 9 o'clock at night, something like that. I don't know. I don't know yet, but I'm just guessing it's going to be a bit later because he's West Coast. So, all right. I will talk to you guys later. Take it easy, and God bless.